My name is Teresa, and I'm from Philadelphia. Philadelphia gets pretty crazy sometimes, but it's home and I'll always have a deep love for the place. But at the end of last year, I was involved in something that's made me reconsider living here altogether, and for the past few months, myself and my boyfriend have been eyeing up more rural places to live. It was a Tuesday night in early December when my boyfriend and I decided to head over to a local bar to get some drinks. Since it was my birthday, we were in the mood to celebrate, and the cold weather had gotten us to the point where we were just dying for something to get us toasty. The bar I'm talking about is a place called Ralph's, and it's on the corner of Terracedale and Bly and Mayfair. You might not be too familiar with that area, but I can assure you, lots of people from Philly have heard of Ralph's by now, and it's not for good reasons. The bar is a pretty nice place, one of those places that used to be a house until it got so it has this real homely feel to it that me and my boyfriend loved. I say loved, we still love it, but I don't think I'll ever be able to stop in there again after what happened. So like I said, it was a Tuesday, my birthday, and it was insanely cold outside. So it took at least 2 Monongahela Rise, PA represent, before we were able to feel human again. The place wasn't that busy, maybe a dozen or so people just hanging out and keeping warm. And for a while, there was a good atmosphere to the place. But then, 2 guys at the bar started having a discussion that started to get real heated. They're raising their voices, getting obviously aggressive with one another, but the bartender went over and told them they either chilled out or would be thrown out and cut off. That kind of calmed them down, but only for a while, and it wasn't long before they started getting confrontational again. Only by then. It was at serious risk of turning into an actual fight, so my boyfriend asked if I wanted to get out of there and go somewhere else. I said sure, but at first I had to use the bathroom so I wouldn't be doing an Irish jig on the way to another bar. I get up, and as I'm walking into the bathroom, one of the guys propels himself from his bar stool and starts getting right in the other guy's face. The other guy then does the same, and soon they're standing up and facing off, with some of the other customers walking over to try and defuse it. I remember looking back at my boyfriend and making a face at him as if to say, "Wow, good timing, babe." And I honestly didn't think the fight would escalate much, especially not in the time that it would take for me to pee. So as I'm sitting there doing my thing, I hear a bunch of commotion, as well as what sounded like glasses being banged on the bar top. Keep in mind, the bathroom was way in the back of the bar and round a corner, so you couldn't really hear what was going on. I figured the fight had either actually jumped off or that the bartender had hit something on the bar top to get people's attention and get them to get out. It didn't sound like what it was, not at all. I know that might sound crazy, but it's true. Nothing about those noises made me too scared or nervous, so I just wiped up and was about to walk back down the corridor to the main bar area, when my boyfriend comes bursting through the door to the ladies' room with his frantic look on his face. I knew something was really wrong right away. Not just because he literally slammed his way through the door of the girls' bathroom, but because he looked more scared than I'd ever seen him before. I didn't even get a chance to get a word out. He just said, "We need to get the F out of here, right now." When one of the bravest people you love most in the world is like, "Pee your pants scared," and says we need to leave, you don't ask questions. I just remember turning, looking up and seeing a small window we could prop open and climb out of. I went first, he followed, and we ran down the block together as I heard him saying, "I need the cops at Ralph's on Mayfair," as he was obviously making a 911 call. When we finally got to a safe distance, I asked him what just happened, and what he described was like something out of a horror movie. People were lying on the floor, groaning or whimpering, and some had blood pooling underneath them. Then I looked up and one of the guys who was at the center of the argument was just walking around, apparently much calmer, and he's saying stuff like, "I told you not to touch me, didn't I? I asked all politely not to put your hands on me, and now look at you, lying there whining." My boyfriend says it wasn't even what he was saying either, it was how he was saying it. Like in this tone you might use to talk to a child you're mad at. I suppose since he'd regained control of the situation in such an evil, violent way, it must make a psycho like him feel almost powerful. And power then brings about a sense of calm or whatever. That's what really messed with my head after the shooting. The guy must have, enjoyed what he'd done to those poor folks, who according to my boyfriend were only trying to break the fight up and not actually hurt the guy who turned out to have the gun. I don't know if the cops ever caught the guy, but I remember my boyfriend calling me into the TV room and pumping up the volume when the whole incident was featured on 6ABC. We were super relieved to hear that no one had actually died afterwards, but as my boyfriend said, the gunshot wounds can be life-changing injuries sometimes. Like people end up dying years after they're shot due to various complications and stuff. I actually prayed that night for the first time since junior high that no one would suffer injuries like that. And that's about the time we started spitballing the idea of moving. There's a lot of gun crime here in Philly, but when it finds a way to reach out and touch you, it's a different kind of scary. Like I said, we're looking at a place outside of the city right now. Commute will be tough as I absolutely hate driving. My boyfriend loves it and I despise it as just too stressful. But it would be considerably less stressful than worrying about someone pulling a gun out in your favorite little bar, on your birthday of all days. My name's Mike, and I work for the Clifton Heights PD here in Pennsylvania. Clifton Heights is a small town here in southeastern PA, about 12 miles outside of Philly. Some of the guys in our department like to listen to your stuff while we do paperwork, as it actually helps us keep calm and focused while we're writing up what can sometimes be some pretty boring stuff. Same works for the heavier stuff too. For some reason, your stories can keep you from overthinking stuff you generally don't want to overthink. And this next thing I'm about to tell you definitely falls under the heavy column. So, last week I was on all nights, and when you come to the end of a shift, you're sometimes praying for a quiet few hours. Anything major means you're stuck at the department, writing stuff up or dealing with perps. So, when we get a domestic disturbance call just before 5 a.m., it was like a real kick in the nuts for me and my partner. The incident in question had a bunch of calls coming in for it, and since it was a domestic thing, we threw it right to the top of our list of priorities and drove out to the 400 block of South Springfield Road. We arrive, get out, and everything seems quiet, but that can be pretty deceptive for a domestic dispute. Sometimes it means the fight is over, the couples have kissed and made up, and our intrusion is nothing but unwelcome to them. I'm serious. You'd be amazed how many times we just try to help and then, suddenly we're the enemy trying to separate a couple who's literally been beating each other bloody for the better part of an evening. But the silence could also mean that the fight's been ended, along with someone's life, and the surviving half of the couple is just trying to deal with the consequences as quiet as possible so as not to alert anyone. Turns out, that's exactly what was happening. But just how that would manifest, we could never have imagined. So like I said, we rolled up to the front of the apartment, knocked a few times, but got no answer. The curtains are drawn on the place's front room, so we couldn't see in there, but there's this little tiny crack in the curtains that I figured I'd be able to look through just to see if anything was going on in there. Usually speaking, and again this might sound a little nuts, but the vast majority of serious domestic violence occurs in the kitchen. I could give you all kinds of reasons why that might be, but from where I'm standing, it's because that's the place with the sharp stuff. Knives, forks, you name it. It's all in the kitchen, and people have a weird thing about stabbing. Like they don't think it'll do as much damage as a bullet will, and in a way they're right. But anyways, as I was saying, I was more looking for clues, and not any actual bodies or anything. I'm looking for blood splatter, bullet holes, empty casings. Anything to give me probable cause to put the boot to the door and get the bad guys. But that night I saw way more than just a little blood, and what I saw might well haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man and a woman, the woman sitting on the carpeted floor back up against the couch with the guy kneeling next to her. In one hand, he had a clump of the girl's hair, in the other he has this huge machete-type one with a little saw blade on the reverse, and he's just sawing into her neck with it. There's blood everywhere, and I mean everywhere, all over her, all over him, all over the floor. Like sometimes it's genuinely amazing how much of that stuff the human body can contain. He's about a third of the way into cutting her with this knife, and the thing I'll never forget is the way her face and head were just jerking from side to side with every pull and push of the knife. It looked like a bad prop from a horror film, you know. Like sometimes you see that kind of thing, and it just doesn't even register that it's real. If the person is alive and screaming or crying, yeah, that hits you with reality, and you feel it. Like deep in your soul. But when they're dead, either in a car wreck or being decapitated like that, it's like you can't even register what's happening. It doesn't look real. Not at first, anyway. I remember it like my brain just switched off for a second. And the next thing I know, me and my partner are taking turns kicking the door's lock, smashing our boots into it and turn like boom 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 until the lock finally smashed into splinters and we were in. My first thought was that the guy would just rush us with a knife and then pop pop, it would be over in a second. But he didn't. Because when we rushed into the room, he just stood up, hands in the air, knife on the floor, saying, "I'm not resisting, I'm not resisting." We put the cuffs on him, dragged him out to the car, then waited for the EMTs to arrive so they could at least try and revive her. But as you can guess, it didn't work. She was long gone before we got there. She was dead before he even tried to take her head off. We think it was all part of the attempt to dispose of the body. As he smashed her over the head with something during an argument, but she wasn't unconscious and was definitely dead by the time he tried to cut. If you need verification for this, you're welcome to look it up. All the details in this will line up, and you can just plug in Nicholas Furia into Google to get all the other info. Guy was 32, and the girl was his ex. They'd been living together, despite being broken up, which was never a good idea, but good God. It tends not to end in murder or decapitation. It was definitely one of the heaviest calls I've ever attended to in my life. I mean, we tend not to get a lot of really bad stuff here in Clifton Heights, sometimes just overflow from Philly, but that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The department has us both on paid leave right now, and we've been offered free counseling on the state's dollar, something I'm definitely going to take them up on. I tend not to have nightmares about stuff, like I have weird dreams. A lot from being overtired and going into deep REM sleep, but it's like actual daydreams when I see that image again. Sometimes I see stuff like moving around all weird. Like last time it was a kid's balloon tied to a fence bobbing back and forth in the wind, and it just reminded me of the way that girl's head was jiggling back and forth as the guy was trying to saw at it. Like I said, I'll definitely be taking the department up on its offer of free counseling, but I just want to take a second to thank you all for the content you put up. You'd be surprised how much your videos have been helping me keep my mind off of stuff, and I'm eternally grateful to the guys I work with who introduced me to your stuff. Anyway, keep up the great work and stay safe. Mike. In late February of 1957, the corpse of a young boy was discovered in the woods near Susquehanna Road in Fox Chase, Philadelphia. The body had been wrapped in a plaid blanket before being stuffed inside a cardboard box, one which had apparently once contained a bassinet. The boy's hair had been cut post-mortem, evidenced by the fact that clumps of hair were stuck in the cadaver. There were signs of severe malnourishment, as well as surgical scars on the boy's chin, ankle, and groin. The body was first discovered by a man checking his muskrat traps, but scared that the police would confiscate them, he failed to report the grim discovery. A few days later, a college student claimed that, after spotting a rabbit running in the woods, he attempted to pursue it. All he found was the boy's dead body, stuffed into the bassinet box. The student reported the find to the police, who swiftly began an investigation. At the crime scene, police discovered a man's blue corduroy cap, a child's scarf, and a man's white handkerchief with the letter G in the corner. Naturally, the case attracted a huge amount of media attention, with the Philadelphia Inquirer printing almost 500,000 flyers depicting the boy's likeness in the hopes that someone would come forward with information. However, despite the huge publicity, the boy's identity is still unknown and the case remains unsolved to this day. Many theories have been floated, but most have been dismissed. Yet, two prevailing explanations have survived due to their plausibility, with one concerning a foster home almost a mile and a half away from the crime scene. Upon attending an estate sale at the foster home, an employee of the Philadelphia Medical discovered a bassinet similar to the one sold at J.C. Penney. This kind of bassinet happened to be shipped in a box identical to the one the boy's body was found in. Bristow also discovered blankets that were similar to the ones used to wrap the boy's body. He began to theorize that the boy belonged to the stepdaughter of the man who ran the foster home, and that they disposed of his body so the stepdaughter would not be exposed as an unwed mother. Definite links between the boy in the box and the foster home. The second plausible theory was brought forward in February of 2002 by a woman known in police files only as Martha. The cops considered Martha's story to be a compelling one, but given her history of severe mental illness, she was deemed somewhat unreliable. Still, Martha claimed that her abusive mother had actually bought the child, whose name was Jonathan, from his birth parents in the summer of 1954. Yet the adoption was far from a dream one, as Jonathan was subjected to extreme physical abuse for 2.5 years. One evening, Jonathan was so sick he vomited, and Martha claimed her mother was so angry that she beat the boy into unconsciousness before drowning him in a bathtub. And this is what the police found so compelling. The boy had bruising around his head, neck, and torso, showed signs of death by drowning, and in his stomach had traces of the very same meal Martha claimed to have been his last, baked beans. When asked for more details, Martha claimed her mother cut the boy's distinctively long hair in an attempt to disguise his identity, then dumped his body in the Foxchase area after concealing it in the bassinet box. The pair were confronted by a passing cyclist, who asked if they needed any help. They were obviously struggling with the concealed corpse, and as Martha's mother pushed her discreetly in the way of her vehicle's license plate, she assured the cyclists that they wouldn't require any assistance. Unbelievably, this story was confirmed by a man who came forward in 1957, who was able to prove that he had been cycling through the area on that particular day. Infamous forensic artist Frank Bender developed a theory that the victim may have been raised as a girl, owing to the unusually long hair and eyebrows which appear to have been trimmed and shaped. 2008 saw Bender release a sketch of the unidentified child, including long hair, which reflected the strands found in the body. Following this, two true crime writers announced they had discovered the boy's identity. They believed he was from Memphis, Tennessee, and requested that DNA be compared between the family members and the child. Local authorities confirmed that they would investigate the lead, but said more research was required regarding the circumstances before they could get a clearance to compare DNA samples. However, in December of 2017, Philadelphia homicide detective Bob Kohlmeyer confirmed that DNA taken from the Memphis man had no connection to the boy in the box. The boy's body was buried at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Cedarbrook, Pennsylvania, which donated a large plot after hearing of the tragic story. The coffin, headstone, and funeral service were donated by the son of the man who had buried the boy in 1957, and whose family still felt an indelible link between themselves and the horrifying and heartbreaking case. There was significant public attendance and media coverage at the burial, with the graves America's Unknown Child. To this day, Philadelphia residents keep the grave decorated with flowers and stuffed animals, and the story of the boy in the box is passed on from generation to generation in hopes that his suffering will never be repeated. It was a warm, balmy summer's day in 1995, when a Pennsylvania fisherman cast his line into the cool, crystalline waters of Brandywine Creek. Brandywine is a tributary of the Christina River in southeastern Pennsylvania, just shy of 30 miles west of Philadelphia. It's a popular spot for local fishermen to indulge their favorite pastime, and as we can imagine, he felt relaxed, blissful, and at one with nature. But after only a short while, the fisherman's serenity was shattered by a pungent and stomach-churning stench. It was one he believed might pass in just a short while, but it soon became obvious that the reek wasn't about to disappear anytime soon. Eventually, the fisherman decided his best course of action was to locate the source of the stench, in the hopes that he might be able to alleviate its olfactory assault. He steeled himself, trying not to retch as he walked, and when the scent grew stronger and more intense, he knew he was on the right track. Within minutes, the fisherman was faced with a large green garbage bag half submerged in a puddle of mud near the creek's edge. He took out a small fish knife and sliced open the bag's thick green plastic lining. He had hoped to find the discarded leftovers of some meat-based meal, something to explain the festering, rotten stench that plagued his nostrils. But when he looked inside and examined the maroon suitcase it contained, what he saw horrified him beyond all comprehension. Inside of the suitcase was the dismembered torso of a deceased female, wearing nothing but a blood-soaked bra. Her face was beaten, bloody, and bruised, barely recognizable as her once living self. Shoved into the suitcase were a variety of other pieces of evidence: a denim blouse, a headband, a quilt, and bloody sheets. As you can imagine, the fisherman quickly fled the scene and contacted emergency services as soon as he was able. When police officers arrived at the scene, they quickly closed the area off before forensic examiners began the delicate task of extracting DNA from the girl's remains. They hoped it would be solved as quickly and diligently as possible, but what followed turned out to be one of Pennsylvania's most perplexing unsolved murders. While observing the scene and the terrain immediately surrounding it, the police officers were quick to note that Brandywine Creek was suspiciously close to what are referred to by locals as the Twin Tunnels. And as many a local Chester County may tell you, these tunnels have a very sinister reputation. It's said that back during the 1910s, a group of Irish workmen were buried alive after the tunnels collapsed on them during their construction. The area quickly became known as the Murderous Mile, and many of the workers were said to have disappeared without a trace. Others tell stories of an unwed mother whose ghost haunts the tunnels after she hanged herself in the area. But unlike that obvious urban legend, the body the fisherman found on that warm July morning was very, very real. The pair of heavily graffitied gray brick tunnels had been abandoned for decades, and part of the reason they're so eerie is down to a sharp curving bend. The effect is that when you enter at one end, the exit is invisible. It's all just claustrophobic darkness, the same kind of anxiety-inducing creepiness that inspired Stephen King to make sewer tunnels the home of the mind-meltingly terrifying It. During the investigation that followed, forensic investigators worked to establish the basic facts of the case. They subsequently concluded that the girl had been dead for between 3 and 7 days, was anywhere between 17 and 40 years old, and was either of European or Latin American extraction. In terms of height, she was around 5'3" and weighed roughly 130 pounds. The girl's legs appeared to have been chopped off after she was murdered, and her demise had most certainly taken place in a different location to the creek itself. Frustratingly, the girl bore no distinctive tattoos or visible scarring, and naturally, her killer had ensured that there were no forms of identification around the body or in the suitcase. Her fingerprints did not match any found in the databases around the country, meaning she had never been in trouble with the law, and was unlikely to be any kind of escort. But most disgustingly, the summer heat and the muddy moisture of the creek bed had horrifically exacerbated the rate of her decomposition, making her features almost impossibly difficult to identify. It didn't take long before police declared there to be nothing in the way of solid leads, and within a week, some journalists were speculating that the case could remain cold for a long, long time. Then, just over 7 months after the initial discovery of the body, hope of solving the case was rekindled after an extremely disturbing discovery was made. Almost 50 miles away from Brandywine Creek, an unexpected jogger almost collapsed with fright when they suddenly were faced with the victim's severed legs. They too had been wrapped in garbage bags, but unlike the first discovery, wild animals had taken the time to rip through the plastic lining before feasting on the rotten flesh underneath. Nearby, another trash bag was found to contain a plethora of female clothing, some that were obviously from different outfits, leading police to believe it could have been a different victim entirely. This was further supported by the fact that the level of decomposition made making a DNA match near impossible. However, when a coroner attempted a sick recreation of a jigsaw puzzle and tried to slot the legs and torsos together, the severed right leg bone fit perfectly into the hip of the torso. And this sparked a frenzy of media interest, and reporters quickly began referring to the dismembered woman as the suitcase Jane Doe. In the years that followed, homicide detectives admitted that the suitcase Jane Doe case was among the most frustrating of their careers. In a 2011 interview with Daily Local News of Chester County, Police Corporal Patrick Quigley was quoted as saying, "These are cases that bother us because we can't even begin to investigate why they're dead until we figure out who they are." Quigley later added, "Adults have a right to disappear. People walk away all the time without it being suspicious, and in some cases, people may not have close family or friends who would report them missing." The producer of the nationally renowned TV show, America's Most Wanted, told the Philadelphia Inquirer that, "These kind of slip through the cracks because you don't have that advocate, that family member to keep the case alive, and it is hard from a storytelling and crime-solving standpoint because you have few clues." Investigators were so stumped that back in 1997, they hired a forensic sculptor to create a clay reconstruction of the murdered woman's face. The same forensic sculptor happened to be the same man responsible for recreating the likeness of John List, and the sculpture just so happened to directly lead to his arrest, almost 20 years after he murdered his own family. The Jane Doe bust led to police receiving hundreds of calls from all over the world, but sadly, none of the information produced any solid leads. That all looked like it was about to change around the turn of the millennium, when the victim's dental records seemed to be a possible match for a missing woman from Virginia. However, on closer analysis, the physical descriptions of the two women didn't match, and it was determined to be yet another false lead. Thankfully, despite many giving up on the case entirely, some investigators not only professed a grim determination to solve it, but they genuinely believe the mystery is just a few clues away from being solved entirely. Many have cited the fact that cold cases can, and sometimes are, solved years, even decades, after. For example, in September of 2018, a Jane Doe found in the state of Tennessee during the mid-80s was finally identified as Tina Farmer. The break in the case only occurred after detectives happened across a blog post detailing Farmer's murder. Police then contacted her family, and followed up by running an in-depth DNA and fingerprint analysis. Although Tina's killer has yet to be identified, it just goes to show how online sleuthing can be far more than just a morbid form of entertainment. It can actually have a tangible effect on the world around us. Who knows? Maybe a story featured on this channel might one day contribute to a family's search for justice. We can only hope. However, back on the law enforcement side of things, there's a huge chance that forensic genealogy might provide the break the case so desperately needs. Forensic genealogy is actually the same process used to convict the Golden State Killer, and as those familiar with perhaps the most famous true crime case of the past 10 years will testify, this is no mean feat, but in the meantime, all we have to go on is the murdered woman's fingerprints, her DNA, and the partial dental records that have all been added to national as well as international databases. And there's always that slim chance that police officers will hit a match at another crime or from another arrested criminal. There's no doubt that there is still a plethora of unanswered questions remaining in regard to the suitcase Jane Doe. Just who exactly was this poor, dismembered woman, so cruelly snuffed out and disregarded in a shallow, muddy creek bed? And did her killer, or even killers, choose to dump her body near the notorious twin tunnels of Chester County? Perhaps they sought to take advantage of the place's frighteningly morbid reputation, assuming that such a cold case would soon pass into legend, with the local populace forgetting it was even a real event. Regardless of their boundlessly evil intentions, the case of the suitcase Jane Doe has most certainly contributed to the site's grim legacy. A legacy that will most likely linger long after the girl herself has been identified and her killer brought to justice. On February 8 of 1917, on the outskirts of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, a young lady by the name of Sarah Corson was sitting in her family's kitchen, brushing her hair, completely unaware of the horror she was about to endure. The 13-year-old was completely blind to the stranger that had crept into her home, a .38 revolver in one hand, a pair of sharpened scissors in the other. When she finally heard the man's footsteps, she simply assumed it was one of her parents. But when he reached around her and tickled her under the chin, the smell of tobacco that rose from his fingers was horribly unfamiliar. When he spoke, she froze, muscles locked up with pure terror as his raspy, wheezing voice drifted down into her ears. "You're a pretty little thing," he said, "and that's awfully nice hair you have." Sarah whimpered with fear, her breath quickening as her survival instincts screamed at her to run and never look back. Yet the stranger detected this. He smelled her fear, and in no uncertain terms, he told Sarah he'd blow her brains out if she screamed. The stranger placed the barrel of the revolver against her skull, then brought the razor's sharp scissors up to her hair, and with one swift snip, he stole a lock of her hair. Suddenly, the cold steel of the revolver's barrel departed her flesh as his hand unwrapped from her throat, and in the next instant, it was gone. A minute went by, and Sarah remained silent. Then 5 minutes, then 10. When it finally seemed like she was alone again, Sarah burst into tears. She cried and wailed and begged for her parents to come to her rescue. They had no idea what had just happened, and even as their daughter tried to explain, she just couldn't seem to find the words. The police were called, and when they arrived, Sarah had calmed down enough to talk to them, but the only useful details she could provide were scant. He was average, very average, of medium build and dressed entirely in black. It was a truly harrowing ordeal, one that the responding officers prayed would be an isolated incident. But within just 2 weeks, 3 other young women filed reports of being preyed upon by a man wielding a pair of sharpened steel scissors. He held them in place, subjected them to a malevolent mockery of affectionate praise, then cut a single lock of hair from their heads before fleeing. Yet the reports contradicted one another's. One girl claimed he was over 6 feet tall, another claimed he was obscenely fat. The third girl mentioned that she felt the bristles of a long beard tickling the back of her neck, while a previous claimed that he was completely clean-shaven. It became obvious that none of the girls had actually seen the man, and that their reports were simply speculation. Their horror had caused them to plug the gaps in their experiences with details that were almost personal to them. A natural response of the victimized, but a burden to investigating officers. There was only one thing each of the officers could agree on, and that was the nickname they were to give the girl's atrocious attacker. This is the story of the Pennsylvania Scissorman. The second girl to be attacked was a teenager by the name of Margaret McEwen, who'd been set upon around Valentine's Day. Just 2 days after the attack, her parents found a handwritten letter in the mailbox of their home, and it was from the scissorman. The scissorman stated that he had, in fact, attacked the wrong girl, and that he'd soon return to claim his intended prize. As you can imagine, this utterly terrified the family. Suffered sleeplessness during the nights that followed. Yet this terror-induced insomnia wasn't entirely unwelcome, as it helped in keeping watch over their daughter, Anna, who was thought to be the scissorman's intended target. However, it appears that the scissorman was watching intently, and simply waited until exhaustion reduced the family's vigilance before he chose his time to strike. On February 22nd, Anna departed her home in the early morning, intent on traveling to school. Her mother and father were sound asleep, their energy reserves utterly depleted as a result of their almost constant watchfulness. As Anna crossed the street and reached the sidewalk on the other side, she felt a large hand grab her by the arm before it dragged her into dense foliage at the roadside. It was the scissorman. The excitement was thick in his voice as he placed the .38 to her temple and warned her not to scream. But thankfully, much like his first victim, he didn't act on his threats of violence. He simply took out that same pair of sharpened steel scissors, clipped a lock of hair from Anna's head, and fled into the nearby woods. The scissorman didn't wait long before he once again indulged his terrifying compulsion, as just over 24 hours after he attacked Anna Corson, he turned his attentions to 14-year-old Nellie McAndriel. hysterical in her home, just after 9 a.m. on February the 23rd. Only this time, instead of stealing just one lock of hair, the scissorman cut almost all of Nellie's hair off. She told police that a man had rang in her home and had at first simply begged for something to eat. Nellie said she couldn't make out the man's features at first due to the screen door that slightly obscured his face. She told the man to go away as her parents weren't home yet. This was the one piece of information she shouldn't have divulged, as, once he realized his prey was home alone, the scissorman burst into the house, pinned her to the wooden floor, and proceeded to cut locks of her hair off over and over and over again. The attack on Nellie McAndrew was a clear sign that the scissorman's attacks were increasing in violence and intensity. He was getting bolder, hungrier. And it seemed only a matter of time before he inflicted much more permanent damage. Once again, the scissorman couldn't wait a day before claiming another victim, but this time managed to keep a lid on his horrifying inclinations. He stealthily cut 13-year-old Florence Irvin's hair as she slept next to her mother, and did so with such discretion that neither of them were stirred from their slumber. Florence's father later told police that nothing seemed to miss when he got up for his early morning work shift at around 2 a.m., but just 6 hours later Florence would wake up to find her hair a few inches shorter on one side of her head. Naturally, given that the news of the scissorman had become widespread by that time, Florence was distraught in knowing she had been the madman's latest victim, and all while she'd been completely unaware. And even more horrifying was the note the scissorman had left on her pillow. "Tell the girl next door I'll be back for her next week." Thankfully, following the attack of Florence Irvin, the scissorman apparently took a break from attacking young girls and waited until the very end of February to strike again. On the 28th of February, the scissorman climbed through the bedroom window of 22-year-old Barbara Feist. She was sleeping in the time before the attack commenced, and when she awoke, the scissorman covered her nose with a chloroform-soaked handkerchief before taking his time in cutting off locks of her hair. Local journalists were quick to report that Barbara had actually received a note from the scissorman on the Monday before the attack. Burglar alarms were installed throughout the Feist home to alert the family in case anyone entered the house. Yet the scissorman seems to have been wise to these defenses, avoiding them entirely in favor of scaling the side of the house. It was later reported that Barbara's brother arrived just as the scissorman was fleeing the scene with a lock of his sister's hair. Given that he was forewarned of the attack, he was armed. And although he was reported to have fired 5 shots from a small-caliber revolver, none of the bullets struck the scissorman, and he was able to escape uninjured and unimpeded. Even as a huge statewide manhunt commenced, the scissorman continued his bladed rampage, with scores of more reports coming in regarding midnight hair cuttings and threatening notes. Yet curiously, the attack on Barbara Feist seems to have been the final legitimate scissorman attack. A 10-year-old girl confessed that despite reporting she was also attacked and had her hair cut on February 28, she had faked the entire thing. Her braids were later found and handed into local police, and they knew well that the scissorman never discarded his victim's hair. She wasn't the only fraudulent claimant either, as when another girl was subject to intense police questioning, she too admitted she made the whole story up, cutting off her own hair before telling her parents she had an encounter with a Pennsylvania scissorman. It raised questions of just how many of these reported attacks had been faked, and an even more pertinent question, why would anyone want to fake such an attack? There are 3 dominant theories regarding the scissorman and the fraudulent claims. All have been explored and fleshed out by law enforcement and amateur sleuths alike. The first is that the police manufactured many of the stories of fake claims in order to detract from the fact that they had otherwise failed to catch the scissorman. If they could establish an appearance of mass hysteria among young women, it meant that they were not responsible for the failure to apprehend him. Yet others argue in a second theory that the reports were in fact nothing but mass hysteria. One girl cut her hair off, probably out of spite or because she didn't like her braids, and blamed a mysterious, scissored attacker to avoid the ire of her conservative parents. This was then repeated over and over by girls with similar motivations, And the scissorman was nothing but a fabrication of angsty teenage girls who sought to rebel against society's expectations. However, the third and final theory, and by far the most terrifying, is that the Pennsylvania scissorman was very, very real. And not only did he genuinely horrify and victimize a string of innocent teenage girls during the First World War era, but the man himself was never caught. That means, for decades after, the scissorman was left to fawn over the trophies he'd taken, reveling in the fact that he was never, ever caught. Perhaps he kept a small wooden box full of his prizes. Perhaps he took them out every so often, bringing them up to his nostrils before drawing a deep huff of their scent and letting the strands dance between his crooked, gnarled fingers, as he fondly reminisced of the terror he had once wrought.